Over the years, I've made a ton of videos about the M1 Garand, and I've come to realize that because this rifle is so iconic and it's held in such high regard by collectors, historians, and shooters alike, people have some strong opinions about this rifle. So today, I'm going to share some of my hot takes about the M1 Garand rifle and its use during World War II that I know not everyone out there is going to agree with, but I'm hoping that maybe after hearing my explanations, more of you will agree. I've made plenty of short 1-minute long videos about the M1 Garand, but today I wanted to make a longer video where I can take my time and really rant about some inconsequential details about this rifle. Let's get into talking about 3 of my takes on the M1 Garand that have proved to be controversial in the past, starting with its pronunciation. I have always said it and will continue to say it, M1 Garand. Every time I make a video about this, the comment section is filled with people saying, oh, it's M1 Garand, not M1 Garand. All right, take a seat, Hermione Granger. Let me tell you something. In my opinion, you can say Garand or Garand and be completely correct either way. Both are fine. Oh, but John C. Garand said his name like that, and the rifle's named after him. So doesn't that mean that's the only correct way to say it? That is true. John Garand did say his name that way, we know that, and the rifle is named after him, but that does not mean that's the only correct way to say the name of this rifle, because that's just not how words work. Let me explain. During World War II, if you asked a US soldier what the name of this rifle was, he'd probably say Garand. And if you asked a factory worker at Springfield Armory where they were making this rifle, they would probably say Garand. And if you watch the World War II training videos where they're instructing soldiers how to shoot this, they refer to it as the Garand. I can't give you an exact reason for why people first started saying Garand instead of Garand. I'm guessing just because that's how it makes more sense to read it in English. Garand is the French-Canadian pronunciation. John C. Garand was French-Canadian, so that makes sense. But Garand is just a bit more natural for a lot of Americans to say. But regardless of how people started saying it that way, most Americans have been calling this the M1 Garand for as long as it's been around, pretty much the entire history of the rifle. And now some people think that we need to throw away the word Garand, the pronunciation that's been used to describe this rifle for pretty much the entire time it's existed, just because we know that that's not how its creator said his name. This really doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and let me give you a made-up example that kind of illustrates that. If you found out tomorrow that the guy who Gillette razors was named after, King Camp Gillette, actually pronounced his name Gillette instead of Gillette, would you start immediately calling them Gillette razors everywhere you went? No, you probably wouldn't, because that'd be silly. Everyone knows the name Gillette, and if you said, pass me the Gillette razor, people would look at you like you're weird. It doesn't matter what the original founder intended. We have an accepted pronunciation of that we use, that everyone understands. And even if the founder didn't say his name like that, which again, that's just a made-up example, words are defined by how we use them and how we pronounce them, not by how the founder of the thing used to say it before they died. Now let me be clear on something. If your reasoning is, I want to say Garand because that's what the founder intended, that's totally fine. A lot of people say it that way. There's totally nothing wrong with that, and some people see it as a way to pay homage and respect to the guy who made this great rifle. That's totally fine. But if your reasoning is you all should say it the way the founder intended, and if you don't, you're wrong, then I would respectfully disagree with you. I think we have great reason to accept both pronunciations today. The people who get really worked up about this and try to say that you're wrong about a certain pronunciation are typically the same type of people who try to tell me that this is a magazine and not an N-blog clip. Now let's get on to my next hot take about the M1 Garand, and that's that I think the safety on the M1 is fine, but I think it has one issue that nobody ever talks about. This is probably the least hot of the takes in this video about the M1 Garand. This doesn't bother me too much, but it's something I wanted to point out because it does bug me a little bit, and like I said, nobody ever complains about this because everyone wants to talk about how the Garand is the perfect rifle, and while it is my favorite, I think this is a bit of a problem. There we go. Now, the function of the safety mechanism on the M1 Garand is actually really great. when you engage the safety, because of how the trigger group is designed, it actually disengages the trigger, so you can't pull the trigger back, but it also captures the hammer here. So there's a little piece on the safety that when you move it into place, blocks the hammer from falling. So it's kind of like two safeties in one. It's extra safe. I have heard some people complain about the positioning of the M1 Garand safety. You can see here that if the safety is engaged, you have to put your finger inside the trigger group up against the trigger to disengage that safety. That I actually don't see as a big problem, especially if you know the context of when this was designed. Back in that era, trigger discipline, or keeping your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire, really did not exist in the military. Soldiers weren't trained to keep their finger off the trigger, they weren't expected to do that, and judging by the thousands of historical photos we have, they didn't do that. Soldiers are typically walking around with their finger on the trigger at all time, so having the safety inside the trigger group where you can leave it on even if your finger's on the trigger, then just quickly flip it off when you're ready to shoot, that part of the design is actually really smart. Now here's where we get to the part about that I don't like, and that's that to disengage the safety, you basically make the same motion as pulling the trigger, just 1 inch forward. Now this obviously wouldn't be a big deal today on the shooting range when you're keeping your finger off that trigger, using proper safety precautions, you're being mindful and paying attention when you're putting that safety on. But it's not hard to imagine if you give 1 million exhausted US soldiers on the front lines this rifle, that some of them might easily make that mistake where they go to make this motion and just don't fully get their finger around the safety and pop a round off by accident. I think especially if you're wearing gloves and you're not getting as much tactile feedback, it'd be kind of easy to grab the gun and pull the trigger thinking you're putting the safety on. Maybe I'm just grasping at straws here. I don't think this is the problem of the century or anything, but as a professional mechanical design engineer, I often think about human factors and how people are meant to use things, and in my opinion, that portion of the design could have been a little bit better. It's hard to find anything that I would improve on the M1 Garand, but maybe the safety is one of those things for that reason. All right, on to the next take, and this is probably the one you've been waiting for. This is my take on the ping thing. If you're at all familiar with the M1 Garand, you probably know that when the last round of an end block clip is fired through the rifle automatically ejects the end block clip. You've likely also heard that that was a major drawback of the rifle because when you fire that last round, that ping sound will let all the enemies in the area know that you're out of ammunition and you're vulnerable to attack. If you've heard that, you've probably also heard the stories of US soldiers using this to their advantage. They would have a fully loaded rifle, but would take an empty clip and throw it to make that distinctive ping sound, tricking the enemy into thinking they were out of ammo. Then naturally, the enemies would all come jumping out from behind cover to attack the US soldier, only for him to valiantly gun them down in the open. That's how the story goes, at least. When you give somebody a rifle that makes a sound when it's out of ammo, it's only natural that some people will think, well, I don't want the enemy to know when I'm out of ammo, and this thing makes a sound, so maybe they'll listen for the sound and know that I'm out of ammo. I don't want that. And I do believe that some US soldiers during the war thought that. They thought that the Germans would listen for them to be out of ammo. But with hindsight being 2020, we know today that that just wasn't happening. First off, this ping sound from an M1 Garand just isn't that loud. There have been a lot of people who have done tests on this, firing rounds and waiting for that ping to see if other people could hear it. There have been some really great YouTube videos about this from Bloke on the Range and Administrative Results. And basically, they found that at typical combat distances, the enemy wouldn't be able to hear that ping at all. This would be even harder to hear if you had bombs going off and all the other sounds of combat going on. Even at pretty close range, the sound of this rifle firing is probably going to ring your ears a lot louder than the ringing of the ping sound coming from the clip being ejected. Next, there's the fact that we have no documentation, at least that I've been able to find, of enemy soldiers talking about listening for that ping sound or getting an advantage from it. You would think that if this was the big problem people make it out to be, we would have plenty of accounts from German, Japanese, Italian soldiers talking about how they're listening for that ping sound and using it against American soldiers, and that's just not the case. The fact seems to be that regardless of what US soldiers might have thought, the enemy was not in fact listening for that ping sound to come from their rifle. Also, knowing that one rifleman is reloading just doesn't give that much of a tactical advantage, even if the enemy was listening for that ping and could hear it. US soldiers typically weren't out there just fighting by themselves as a one-man army, so typically if one guy ran out of ammo, the guy next to him probably has a full clip in his gun ready to cover that guy while he reloads. It's important for us who study history to remember that just because soldiers believed something at the time it was going on doesn't necessarily mean that that's the exact truth. I'm sure anyone who's been in the military could probably tell you that superstitions, rumors, and myths about the gear they're given or about combat are very common. And this would have been even worse at a time of a huge global conflict like World War II. There were a lot of inexperienced soldiers heading to the front lines, and rumors like this one about the M1 spread like wildfire. This leads me to the second part of my hot take, which is about whether US soldiers would throw an empty clip to lure out enemy soldiers because they were listening for the ping. As far as I can tell, this also didn't really happen, at least not successfully. Like we discussed, enemy soldiers just weren't listening for that ping sound, so there's no reason why this would work. The logistics of when you would even try using this to distract the enemy also just don't make sense to me. I've seen a lot of people try to come up with these really convoluted, specific one-off situations where this might benefit the US soldier, and none of them have ever made sense. Now, in my opinion, of course, a scared US soldier heading to the front line who's never been in combat before is going to believe this awesome story about a super clever soldier who used this trick to get one over on those stupid enemies. Now, this story would be a great morale booster. It makes the US soldiers seem really smart and the enemies seem really dumb and trickable in comparison. Stories like this were common, and of course they spread throughout the army, but do you really think that's the reality of what was going on the front lines? Now, just because we know now that this wouldn't work and the enemy wasn't listening for that ping, doesn't mean that no US soldiers ever tried this during World War II. Personally, I do believe that with how popular this story was, some US soldiers probably did try using this trick during World War II. Maybe they even shot a few enemies in the process by coincidence. But I don't believe it happened the way it does in that story, where the enemy soldiers hear that ping and jump out from behind cover and then get gunned down. That just doesn't make any damn sense. Well, even though those takes weren't too controversial, I'm sure that managed to piss a lot of people off, because that seems to always be what happens when I share my opinions about this iconic rifle. Whether you agree or disagree with me, let me know in the comments your thoughts on my M1 Garand takes. That's all from me, guys. Remember to subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.